Hi, and welcome to Methods of Social Research. My name's Nicholas Harrigan, or Nick. The course code for this number is SOC224 or SOCX224 if you're an OUA student. And this week's lecture is on qualitative data collection, though in different parts of the guide it's also called fieldwork, ethnography, focus groups, in-depth interviews, and even open-ended survey questions. Before we start, I just want to start with an acknowledgement of country, which I've been meaning to do, and I apologize for not having done so far. But Macquarie University, and in fact the whole nation of Australia, is located on Indigenous land that was never ceded. And I want to pay. I know that Macquarie University itself is on the land of the Darug Nation, and I want to pay my respects and our respects to elders past, present, and future. Sometimes I feel these welcome to countries are quite performative, but what I'd like to do for this course, if and when I get the time, is to prepare some examples later in semester of how all these different research methods we've done have been used to try to show the true history of Indigenous people and to overcome many of the myths that we as a colonial nation tell ourselves, and also expose those myths using all the different methods we've learnt in this class. So just to give you one example of that, which are two examples which are quite incredible. There's a series of research that's been done on how many Indigenous people were killed during colonization, and there is some really fascinating empirical academic studies that show that it was about a third of the population, which means it's in the hundreds of thousands, mainly by settlers and also by small army outposts. And the way they found this was by going through diaries about expeditions by the colonialists and settlers themselves, and basically they sort of statistically analyzed it, looking at how many people were killed in the diaries, and then what percentage of the diaries represented the number of actual likely activities that were done by the settlers. I'll go into it more later on, but it's quite fascinating. There's also another very famous book that is really worth getting your hands on, called Dark Emu. I think it's by Bruce Pascoe, and available on Amazon, available at most bookstores in Australia. It goes through the diaries of colonists, settlers, and even sort of discoverers, in inverted commas, the explorers of early colonization, who were the first people to reach many indigenous communities, and shows that there was quite advanced economies in those areas. So rather than just a hunter-gatherer society, there were settlements and there was farming and so forth. It's quite remarkable. Anyway, that's my very short welcome to country, or not welcome to country, acknowledgement of traditional owners. So with that said, I want to move on to this week's class. Qualitative data collection. So basically this week is one of two that we focus really in depth on qualitative data collection and analysis. Remember, the context for this lecture, and I guess is that we deal with, most of the whole course breaks into two parts. One is on data collection and the other one is on analysis. There is also some stuff on and also project design, but data collection and project design, and then later on we do analysis and write-up. So this fits into the data collection part and project design half of the course. And remember that within that we are going to talk about qualitative and quantitative methods. Qualitative methods meaning things like coming from the word quality, meaning analysis of words and pictures without the transformation of those words and pictures into numbers, and the other type of methods which we're going to do in later weeks are various quantitative methods, so surveys, experiments, etc. Actually, there will be some qualitative methods in the historical comparative week, so this is not the last data collection on qualitative methods. But this week we are focusing very heavily on 4 methods. Those methods are fieldwork, which is what you do in ethnography. The Department of Ethnography, it's going and living with a community for 6 months or 2 years, and making huge amounts of notes each evening after you have lived with this community. They're sort of archetypical example of this for an Australian anthropology or ethnographic interviewer might be to go and live with an indigenous community or a community in Papua New Guinea, but it doesn't have to be that. You could do ethnography, and people have done ethnography going and hanging out in a high-tech office or living in an ordinary family's home, or so forth. In an ordinary meaning, a regular middle class or working class family home in Australia. So that's field work. There's also focus groups, which is what is often used for working out how companies can sell products and how politicians can buy votes or convince people to vote for them. It involves getting a group of 4 to maybe 12, but generally around 8 people in a room with a facilitator, and the facilitator asks some very general questions about their opinions on a particular topic. So it might be like, what soda do you like to drink, or what chips do you like to eat, and why do you like those chips? Or it could be, what do you think of the current opposition leader? And they all go, who's that? Or what do you think of Labour? Or what do you think of the Liberals? And it gets impressions, it gets their opinions on issues of the day, say around the Catholic Church and pedophilia would be a big one that would be incredibly controversial and would be dividing Australian society in quite interesting ways at the moment. And the focus group attempts to capture the attitudes and opinions within the group, including the diversity and how they argue with one another. The third method that we're going to go through, and this is, sorry, I'm not looking at the slides here, we're just looking at the overarching mind map. This is an introduction. Would be in-depth interviews. So this is where you sit down one-to-one generally, and for an hour or 3 hours or several days, and do a detailed interview with an individual. And then there's also which is the qualitative method, which we're going to deal with in a second, called open-ended survey questions, which is what we're going to use mostly in our data collection for this class, which is where you have a survey and you have a series of very simple questions, like they might be like I've done with migrant workers, when people answered yes to have you been limited from leaving the house. This is with domestic workers. It's like I said, oh, can you tell us exactly what happened? Or can you give us an example? And you'll note down an example there in the open-ended survey question. Okay. Before we get into these, again, this is not on the slides, but I really want to do this. I think it will dramatically help improve your understanding. I want to give you some very concrete examples of the sorts of things what the final products of qualitative data collection is. And the reason I'm doing this is because I've certainly found with friends and colleagues and collaborators who aren't familiar with qualitative research, often the best way to get them to understand what we're doing is to give them the total model. I give them an example of a final write-up. So that's what I'm going to do with you very quickly. These you will find on iLearn. I'm going to put these up under optional additional reading. But let me just show you each of them very quickly. So we've got to get out of this. And I'll bring this down. Come on. Dun, dun, dun. View. Full screen. there it is, full screen. Okay, so the first example I want to talk to you about is probably one of the most famous and quite exciting, and also I think it was dealt with in your ethics lecture, the training that you did with Macquarie University Ethics Committee, which is Sudhir Venkatesh's Gang Leader for a Day. This is a book that was written a few years ago now, I think about 10 years ago now, but it was by a former graduate student at Columbia University, so one of the, not Columbia, Chicago University, one of the top universities in America and in the world, very prestigious, and this guy is now a full professor at another Ivy League university, I think Columbia, could be wrong. Anyway, this is a account of how he basically lived with a drug gang for about 7 years of his PhD. And it is remarkable for it's just such a beautifully executed example of a piece of ethnographic research. It's also just super exciting. And for that reason, maybe it's a bit, maybe there's problems with it being super shiny and all those glitzy and so forth, but it's certainly an attractive read. And I've given you the very first chapter there, which I would recommend everyone read, because if you read this, you get what ethnography is. I'm going to take you through it very briefly, because in this introductory chapter, he does a few things that are really interesting and crucial. So the chapter is called How Does It Feel to Be Black and Poor? And this is built around the fact that it's to show how stupid quantitative research, i.e. using numbers and surveys, can be. And in this reflection, he basically goes through an account of his motivations, why he was attracted to qualitative research, and then a really bad experience with doing a survey. If you read on pages 3 and 4, what you get here is in a tiny page, a very good account of how qualitative researchers see their work and why they value it. So let me just go through this. As part of my heavy course load at the University of Chicago, I began attending seminars, where people ask where do preferences developed, how did we predict human behavior. He says the standard mode of answering these questions was to conduct surveys and complex mathematical models that would produce a statistical snapshot, why you maybe failed to find a job or ended up in prison. It was seen as a good way to formulate policy. And he says, well, I liked these researchers, the questions they were asking. Compared with the vibrant life I saw on the streets of Chicago, the discussions were cold, distant, and abstract and lifeless. I found it particularly curious that most of the researchers seemed interested in even meeting the people they wrote about. It wasn't necessarily animosity, but nearly all of them were well-intentioned, but but actually talking to a research subject was seen as kind of messy, unscientific, and maybe a source of bias. Mine was not a new problem. Indeed, in the field of sociology, it had long been divided into two camps: those who use quantitative and statistical techniques, and those who study life by direct observation of living people. The second group, normally called ethnographers, use their first-hand approach with particular questions. How do people survive in marginal communities? What makes government policies work for some families and not others? While quantitative sociologists, meanwhile, often criticize the ethnographer's approach, that it isn't nearly scientific enough and the answers may be relevant only to a particular group under observation, i.e. it wasn't generalizable. Note that word that we've talked about already, generalizable knowledge. However, my frustration hadn't coalesced yet, and so I did what I thought would be a smart thing to do, which is to go to basically the most famous guy in the department, a prominent African American, and ask to help him do research. I'm going to finish it there, the sort of summarizing. But basically what happens from there is that he is sent to a series of high-rise projects in California, in Chicago, and he basically goes to half-empty block that has been abandoned, but it was probably 15 stories high, but the lift don't work and there's no electricity and so forth. And what he does is he goes in there to do one of these surveys that he's been given by this most famous sociologist, one of the most famous sociologists in the world at the time. We're talking in the late 80s, mid 90s here. And basically he gets held up by a gang in the stairwell, like a African-American gang of basically drug dealing young people. And then they force him to do his survey on them, right, at gunpoint. And his first question, I kid you not, is here on page 13 and then 14. He says, I was sweating and I leaned backwards to try to get some light on the questionnaire. The first question was one I had adapted from several other similar surveys. It was one about a set of questions that targeted young people's self-perceptions. How does it feel to be black and poor, I read. And then I gave them multiple choice answers. Very bad, somewhat bad, neither bad nor good, somewhat good, or very good. The guy with the too big hat began to laugh, which prompted the others to start giggling. Fuck you, he told me. You've got to be fucking kidding me. And he does this beautifully to illustrate how stupid people can be with quantitative questions. How a quantitative approach can completely screw up almost everything that sociology is supposed to be about. And I challenge you with all of your questions that you design in this course and for your project to ask yourself, is this a how does it feel to be black and poor moment when you're reading out your question? Because you don't want to be having those moments. Anyway, it turns out he gets held up and then he talks to them. He meets the gang leader who ends up making space for him to study them, and he ends up living with them for 7 years. It's quite an amazing book. There's also, within it, you'll see illustrations of many of the concepts we learn later on. Anyway, that's the first reading I want to show you. That's probably the longest it's going to take with this one, but let me go on to some of the others. All right, number 2, I just want to show you, where is my mouse? Okay. Next one I'm going to show you very quickly is, we won't go into this, but this is my friend and colleague Tiago Opperman, who is at the Australian National University, and he spent about 15 months in Papua New Guinea. I asked him to write up something for my research methods class in Singapore a few years ago, but it's incredibly relevant to you. And he talks about what is anthropology over 4 pages. It's funny and very spot on, and very interesting and very provocative. I won't say much about it, but just to say that that's there, take a look. I'll also point out that he gave us, which is also going to be on the iLearn, his example of his field notes, which is sweet of him. So he starts off, he says, I haven't had time to translate the bits that are in Tok Silan and Halia, which are 2 of the languages of Papua New Guinea. So there's lots of, and Bougainville, which is a particular island in Papua New Guinea. So there's lots of weird terminology in there. So that, I guess that will add to the feeling of authenticity. Your students will be authentically confused. He's hilarious. But anyway, he starts off with a whole series of photos. This is a court where someone is being tried. This is the judges. This is the accuser. This is the defendant. This is his girlfriend at the time doing participant observation coconut farming, meaning she's basically coconut farming and pretending to be a researcher. And this is an election rally, a few photos from election rallies. These faces are hilarious. A variety of self-explanatory faces, many looking very confused. And then, yeah, some more election rallies in the rain, and playing musical instruments and so forth. It's fascinating. And then there is about, I don't know, 4 or 5 or 10 pages of field notes. The main thing to just do here is to have a quick look over them and get a sense of what field notes really look like. It's actually, all this information has been anonymized. And I just want to point out within this, there's a little tip that's included in the textbook about how recording equipment such as videos and cameras often don't work. And this is a real contrast to what most students think. They think if they record everything, it'll be awesome and it'll be wonderful. But basically the textbook says they're frequently out of range, they break, and I think they also say you'll never actually listen to them again because you'll have too many hours of recording. So take field notes. And what Tiago twice in this talks about how, once here he says how the people wore powder and I got dosed about the cheeks as well, which made photographing things hard because the talc got into everything and fucked the lens. I don't know what it is about ethnographers, but they swear a lot. And then later on he says that the recording broke as well, the audio recording for something else. So it turns out that this one random ethnographer makes the same arguments as the textbook, which I find fascinating. Okay, now two last things I want to show you. These are again on the optional readings to give you a sense. So that's field notes, beautiful example of field notes. This is a report on migrant workers in Singapore that I was worked with about 100 other people on writing. It's up there. It's called Labour Protection for the Vulnerable, and it's about the salary and injury claims process for migrant workers. It's done with a non-government organisation called TWC2 and a very small trust that gave us $10,000 to do the study. And that is Shredder in the background, if you can hear him trying to eat hay. Anyway, it was published in 2017, just before I left Singapore. What is amazing or interesting about this is that it is done by volunteers, including these people, many of them students at my university and volunteers for the NGO. We managed to get the former Attorney General to stick his neck out and write a foreword for us. And then in here we actually interview 150 workers and present the results of our study as qualitative research. Most of that qualitative analysis is presented in chapter 3, so that's where I want to go to and just show you what a qualitative analysis looks like for a policy report. So remember we talked about how there's basic research and there is applied research. So this is an example of applied research. And hopefully your research will be used for something like this. So this is chapter 3, key findings from interviews. We have an introduction, and then we basically go through with the thematic analysis. So it starts off and it says, basically pulls out one of the first themes, which is what happens when workers make a claim. They basically get sacked. So they say, so they have a lawyer quoted here who says that, the system doesn't work because workers get sacked. Then we have a Bangladeshi worker here and a Chinese worker here. The Chinese worker says, I've been on special pass, which is basically a pass you're on that allows you to not work but can stay around for the court case for a year or two. And I've been holding a special pass because my work permit was cancelled by employer. I don't have money for salary, transport, food or other expenses. My employer gives me $2 to $5 every 2 or 3 days. I do not have any money to pay for medical treatment. I sleep at the work site, so he sleeps on a construction site, and I have to borrow money for food and transport. So it's an example of some of the sort of problems that they face. We go on, and if you have a look at it, there are examples of basically many different themes that come up throughout the work, and each one is illustrated with basically a sort of an abstract summary of what the data said, and then an example quote from the field notes or from interviews with workers or lawyers and so forth. I won't go into it. I just want to say it's there, and it's a good thing to give you a sense of how analysis of low-wage workers has been done in other contexts and in a policy report. The last example I want to show you of qualitative research is an example of basic research using almost the same data. I don't think it's not using the same data because they were two different samples, but this is a paper that I wrote. Again, it's for the Journal of Immigrant and Minority Health, and it's on the threat of deportation as a proximal determinant of mental health amongst migrant workers, which sounds suitably boring and, you know, abstract to be an academic paper. If you want to get a sense of it, the abstract is the place to start. It simply says that migration harms people. That's our theory, not just being poor, but also being a migrant in and of itself. So we do a path analysis and a statistical study of basically 600 migrant workers in Singapore, and we show that that basically being threatened with deportation and having conflict in the workplace are the big predictors of poor mental health. And then in study 2, we ask, why are workers with workplace conflict threatened with deportation? And we show through a thematic analysis of 149 qualitative interviews that they are deported basically because it allows the employer to exert influence over them and to exert their power and get what they want in a workplace conflict. That's a bit long, but let me just, the main thing I want to show you here is what we do in terms of the analysis. You can look at it yourself. So there's a whole lot of statistics. This is study 1, but then study 2, we actually did a few different qualitative analyses. Oh, this is it though, here it is. So reasons for deportation. We found that migrant workers talk about 7 main reasons that deportation was used in workplace conflicts. They were to enforce workplace discipline, thwart complaints, force early return from medical leave, stop workers from seeking independent medical treatment, reduce medical treatment and medical leave costs, punish for fake injuries, and remove damaged and injured workers. That is an example of 7 different themes in a thematic analysis. And then if you go through, you will see how the thematic themes. So note, we've got 1, 2, 3, and note basically this is like, we did 151-hour interviews, and the whole qualitative analysis was reduced basically to 7 intro sentences and 7 quotes, which you could imagine could feel disempowering, but honestly, as the reader, you'll probably appreciate it. So I'll just give you one here that's amazing. So one of the themes that came up in the 150 interviews we did was that employers used threats of deportation to disallow medical leave. So injured workers were being threatened when they refused to work while on medical leave, right? So you get a doctor's certificate, medical leave doctor's certificate for being injured. And here's a quote. He had a broken right leg. So it's from Field Notes. It's written in the third person. He had a broken right leg. He'd broken his right leg badly, and he had to undergo minor operations to avoid permanent damage. He was given medical leave of a year. To his dismay, he was asked to go back on light duty, which is basically go back to work, but on light, not full-blown construction work, but maybe sweeping floors and so forth, 2 months after his accident. Mahmoud said, looking worried, "My boss is very clever. He said he will cut my permit if I do not agree to his term." Mahmoud, 21, Bangladesh. Now that name is made up, it's anonymized, and it's a very short quote, so you can't identify him. But this is a thematic analysis. One top title, an intro sentence, an example quote, move on. And that's, I think, the reason I point this out is this is a very academic way and a very succinct way, and also a very basic research way to do, and a very positivist way to do qualitative research. There's another example here which you can look at, which is we thematically looked at what does a deportation threat actually look like, and so we go through and talk about indirect threats, direct threats, dismissals, and attempt to deport, or use of violence. And then we have quotes under each of them and present them as a table. So it's another way to present a thematic analysis, very simply. Okay, that was a long intro, but I think very crucial to give you a sense of where we're going to with this research. This is the end product. Now let's talk about the process of getting there, and particularly the process of data collection. So, the lecture. In this lecture, we're going to cover we're basically going to go through a series of steps which have been labeled here. We're going to start off by looking at analytical techniques. So how do you do this, and sort of gives you a sense of where we're going. Then we're going to look here at the different methods, which I've already mentioned: fieldwork, open in-depth interviews, focus groups, open-ended survey questions. And then it's basically, I'm going to deal with 3 relatively miscellaneous topics on what types of questions are good to ask when you do qualitative interviewing, what types of sampling are useful do you use when you do qualitative data and data collection, and then some notes on note taking. So let's go through it very quickly, as quickly as we can. So three things. Okay, I want to start with this concept of the ethnographic sandwich, which is up the top here. The ethnographic sandwich. Sorry. The deal with the ethnographic sandwich is not in this textbook, but it is described in the definitions of the concept, key concepts that I've provided you on the iLearn site. So look there if you want to see it in more detail. The ethnographic sandwich is a way for you to try to understand what the role of ethnographic research is, particularly in what's called a mixed method study, where you have both ethnographic research and quantitative research. But you can also think of it, what's the role of ethnographic research or qualitative research, I should just say, qualitative research in the context of the larger study for generalized knowledge. And the ethnographic sandwich is this idea that if you do any quantitative study, it really needs to have qualitative work at the beginning and at the end, like a sandwich. So it's an approach to quantitative research that maybe valorizes it and values it more, the quantitative research, but it builds qualitative research into that. And it says that it's the ethnographic or qualitative work is the 2 pieces of the sandwich with the quantitative work in the middle. So what the hell does that mean? It means that there are 2 times you really want to do ethnography, right? One is before you've done any major data collection or major quantitative data collection. And the reason you do that is so you don't seem like to swear again, a fucking idiot, right? If you design survey questions for a community you've got no idea about, if you design an experiment around a community you've got no idea about, then you're an idiot, a fool, and probably also unethical. The reason for this is very simple, which is that you need to use qualitative experiences of your own, and also reading around the area, but just actually to understand more about the community. Clearly you can't do this. You could do this if you did this in a very systematic way you were going to write up, then you would need to do it as, you need to get ethics approval for it. However, in many cases, it's just a matter of going and having coffee with experts and chatting to people in your life and just going and standing in public spaces and observing them, whatever the community is. So you don't seem like an idiot. Rabbits in the background, sorry. Okay, so you don't seem like an idiot. So the short answer is the top bit of the bun, if you want it, the first bit, you do ethnographic research in order to come into closer proximity with the community, to develop maybe some contacts, but mostly to get background information and familiarity with some of the issues in that community. The other thing is the bottom part of the sandwich, which is after you've done some, and in particular, sorry, just to say, and in terms of that first part of the sandwich when you go and meet people, it also helps you to develop theories and hypotheses to test, right? So the idea is that ethnography can be this exploratory, or quality research can be this exploratory part, either formal or informal, depending on whether you get ethics approval and depending on how much contact you have with participants and so forth, but where you just get to know the topic you're talking about. And from that, the theories and hypotheses ideally should emerge. It's a very much what they call inductive research, meaning that it comes from the data upwards. You can imagine then there is that from that there's the meat in the sandwich, which is say doing a survey to test some hypotheses, or designing experiments, which are to test hypotheses, or many other quantitative methods, doing a content analysis. And then at the end of that, after you've done that process, what's going to happen is that you'll have found some interesting correlations, right? Some interesting statistics, some interesting effects. You may have, in my case, in the mental health paper, we found that if you're in workplace conflict, say a salary or injury claim, you are much more likely to be threatened with deportation. It turns out that, just to give you the example of the statistic, this is a statistic we found. We found that if you had not been in a workplace conflict, you had about and you're a migrant worker in Singapore, you had about a 10% chance of being threatened with deportation. If you had had a workplace conflict, you had about a 66% chance of being threatened with deportation. That is dramatic, obviously, right? And but then the question was why, right? And many people who read the quantitative part said, well, maybe they were just the lazy workers, right? Maybe they deserve to get threatened with deportation. And maybe the threat of deportation is what led to their injury. Maybe the deportation happened because these were unsafe workers who were working badly, and they got threatened with deportation, and then they also got themselves injured because they're incompetent. So I guess that's plausible. But the point to say is that the quantitative research found a correlation, right? It found a correlation between the workplace injury and a threat of deportation. Now, the second half of the ethnographic sandwich, the ethnographic or qualitative research that's done later, its role is to try to understand the mechanisms between two correlated variables or multiple correlated variables. And you can see that in our research where we said, well, why were they threatened with deportation? Then we went through all the interviews, and they're all about basically thwarting complaints and preventing people from accessing medical injuries, leave, or medical treatment or such. Okay, so basically, if I can cut it all down, the first part of the ethnographic sandwich is exploratory and orients the researcher and helps you to develop hypotheses. The second half of the ethnographic sandwich allows you to understand more detailed mechanisms between correlated variables. There's probably other things you can do with qualitative research, but I think they're the two really big ones and very useful ways to think about it. Okay, apologies for the long explanation. Let's move on. So that was the ethnographic sandwich. And it's really crucial for study design that you understand why you would do ethnographic research. Okay, so what do you do when you get ethnographic data? Where are we going here? Look, the answer, which you should have already worked out, is what is called, I don't call it, everyone calls it this, thematic analysis. There are other ways to do this. Some qualitative research, particularly ethnography, tends to be kind of written up almost in a sort of I don't want to say almost a novel-like way, but very much some level of stream of consciousness, some level of copying a lot of literary styles and so forth. But the more positivist styles of qualitative research definitely takes this form of, and actually it takes this form of what's called thematic analysis. Now, you've already seen thematic analysis in the examples I gave you at the beginning, but thematic analysis, to give you a definition, is when you go through a large amount of qualitative data, say tens or hundreds of interviews or tens of hundreds of qualitative questions, and qualitative survey questions, and you attempt to identify what are the common themes within that, particularly in common themes that answer a particular research question you have. So the examples that I've given are why are workers threatened with deportation, and we found that it was because of those 7 themes I showed you earlier. Okay, another concept you won't find in the textbook, but you will find in almost every qualitative research academic article, particularly from a positivist direction, so the people who are more sciencey and natural sciencey, is this concept of saturation. We'll deal with it more later on, but I just want to mention it. It basically means that when you're doing your thematic analysis, how do you know when to stop? And how do you know when you've got enough data? And the concept of saturation says that you've got enough data, and you know you've got enough data when no new themes start coming up, and when you start reading further and more interviews, and the same themes keep on coming up. So if you, example, had 25 interviews that you'd done for a particular topic, and after interview 18, between interviews 19 and 25, no new themes came up, and instead they just kept on coming up with the same themes that you've already identified in the first 18 or 19 interviews, then you would be in a position to say, I have reached saturation. There are lots of potential problems with this as a way of doing things, but it is certainly a key word that is used, and like the problems are, right, like that. I mean, how many times can you cut up how many pieces can you cut, say, a piece of cheese into, right? How much can you how much can you divide the head of a pin or whatever? And it turns out it's infinite. So I'm not sure that there is completely satisfying, but certainly it's a term that's used. It's a term that sort of that gives some level of legitimacy to the methods, and so you just need to know what it means. So saturation, there you go. Okay, moving along. So we're going to go down now and look at the 4 different methods that I've mentioned: fieldwork, focus groups, actually in-depth interviews is over on the left, you can't see it, number 8, and open-ended survey questions. So let's jump into them. So fieldwork is what you've seen in Tiago's, example of that is in Tiago's notes, where he went to PNG. Also, ethnography is pretty much what Sudhir Venkatesh did in his interviews. His 7-year living with a ganglet gang. The formal definition of ethnography is, I think, a description of a community from the insider's perspective. So it is a description of how this community in PNG conceptualizes and understands themselves from their perspective, or similarly, it's how an attempt to understand how this drug gang in the US understood themselves from the inside. So it turns out within fieldwork is the formal term for basically for doing qualitative research by going and spending a lot of time with a community, generally in an informal way. So basically going and living with people, or just spending a long time hanging around. And another form of it is called participant observation. Participant observation means that the researcher is both a participant and an observer. So you saw Tiago had his friend Jemima in one of those photos doing participant observation coconut farming. That was sort of a joke on Tiago's part, but it's partly true. Basically what it meant was that she was just helping them do coconut farming, and then each night writing up her notes as an ethnographer and doing her PhD thesis. Okay, there are a couple of different ways of talking about it and naming what is done in fieldwork. Naturalism is a really important concept. It is basically one of the justifications for doing fieldwork as against other methods, or doing qualitative research as against other methods, but particularly fieldwork. And naturalism is an approach to scientific knowledge and academic knowledge and knowledge in general, which says that the best way to find out about the world is to experience it in a natural setting. Now, natural doesn't mean you go out in the bush, and hang out in jungles and stuff. No, naturalism means that it's in contrast to studying it with probes and survey questions and trackers and or interviews in artificial circumstances and so forth. It's basically go and live with the people and you will find out how the people are. Okay. Another key word, and these are just 4 keywords that are used a lot, so you need to know the terms, is field site. And a field site is basically any location where you do field work. So that could be offices of a company, it could be a school, it could be a home, it could be a community in Papua New Guinea, etc. Okay, just some key terms. All right, slide 5. What are some strategies for success? So this is a pretty big list, which I'll move through quickly, but again, really key concepts for knowing how to be a good ethnographer. So gatekeeper. One is to recognize that almost every field site and every community has gatekeepers. And gatekeepers are people who can let you in or block you from getting in. Sudhir Venkatesh, in his book, the gatekeeper was, I think, called JD, who was the gang leader, who actually happened to have done a sociology degree as a younger self, and was really encouraging of the Sudhir Venkatesh to actually come and do ethnographic research by living with his community, his gang, basically. That's a gatekeeper. They're almost always crucial because one of the biggest problems you have with any research is actually just getting participants and getting access. Okay. An informant sounds like a gatekeeper, but it's not quite the same. An informant is someone who provides you with information about the community. Often it can also be someone who introduces you to other people as well. The difference between an informant and a gatekeeper is the gatekeeper gives you access to the field site. The informant can be within the field site. Often the idea with an informant is that you will develop some really key contacts who will school you through understanding that community. And so they end up being crucial. All right. Normalization is a strategy for, so we're on the 3rd point here, normalization. That is a strategy for what you need to be able to do to have success in a field site, and you achieve success by basically fading into the background. At some level, or not just fading into the background, but it just being normal that you're around, because you don't want people being self-conscious as they're around you. Often for the first few weeks or months, you are treated as an outsider and everyone's on best behavior. But as you're around more and as you do the 4th thing, which is build rapport, then you will start to not be noticed, and people will act more naturally. Okay, number 4, building rapport. So this is one of the most crucial techniques that you can use to build rapport, for success. And that means basically, how do you get people to trust you and to like you and to actually open up to you and allow you access to areas that an outsider would not normally see. And the main techniques for building rapport tend to be doing things like small favors. So Venkatesh turns up with some beers in that first chapter, and so small favors. You also can so Tiago talks about how he built rapport, which was he said that basically the 3 pastimes in his community that he were drinking, philandering, and smoking, I think. Something like this. And he said he had a girlfriend and he didn't smoke or drink. So he tried to make up for this by telling dirty jokes. Okay, well, that was a way for him to build a rapport. Hilarious, but whatever. Okay, but you've got to try and find ways to do that, and there's a few other ideas in the textbooks for this. Continuous negotiation. This is basically the idea that you're continuously negotiating for access. You don't just get access to a field site and that's it, but actually you're constantly negotiating around that. Going native is generally seen as a bad thing. As a researcher, going native is when you come very, very close so close to the community that you lose your level of objective approach to the community, and your commitments are moved from that of being a researcher to overly identifying with the community. Now, there are lots of reasons why it's hard to identify when this is, but because many of us are involved with different communities because of our values, and so to say that you have values that identify with the poor or the underprivileged or etc. is not to have gone native, but possibly you would consider you'd gone native when you were simply unable to, you felt all of a sudden a commitment to the goals of the community over any sort of sense of commitment to objective research. So, you felt the need to lie in your research. That said, even that could probably be ethically justified in the right circumstances. Okay, earnest novice. This is a concept that one of the best ways to build rapport and to normalize your state, and also just to not behave like a complete idiot when you're in the field, is to relate to all of the informants and participants and members of the community within your community as though you're an earnest novice, as though they are the experts and you've got a lot to learn from them, and you're doing so in an earnest way. This is it's basically a psychological approach to the issue, how you are going to relate to them, and apparently from many different people's experience, it's a really good way to a good approach to take. And I guess I read it as, your other options are to come in and behave like you're an expert, and to be honest, people are just going to hate you. These people often have to deal with privileged pieces of shit who think that they're amazing and that they've got a ton to teach the world all the time. And they don't need the guy who's or girl who's researching, or woman who's researching their community to be another professional who tells them what to do. They've got enough of those in their lives. So switching that around and becoming an earnest novice where this community has got a lot to teach you is a pretty good way to relate to whoever you're studying in ethnography. Another point in terms of how to get along and have success in ethnography is to show the appearance of interest. This doesn't mean being fake, but it does mean that in a sense sometimes we all have the social obligation to pay attention and to show interest in things that we don't necessarily find super fascinating. And in ethnography, that happens a hell of a lot of the time. And the reason for that is that, we do have different interests to our participants. Their lives might seem boring to us. But if you let people know that, they're going to close up and hate you and think you're a snob. So appearance of interest is pretty important. Okay, last three concepts. Attitude of strangeness. One of the things that to be successful in ethnography you need to do is to adopt what they call an attitude of strangeness. It's which is an approach to a particular setting. Now, it's really easy to have an attitude of strangeness if you're in a strange setting for you, right? And not a non-normal situation for you. So if you go to a corporate law firm, or you go to hang out in a political party like Central Committee, or you get to go and hang out in a Papua New Guinean village, or with sex workers in Vietnam, or wherever, you will find it very easy probably to adopt an attitude of strangeness because it is strange to you. However, if you are in your own community, that can be a lot harder. Take a couple of examples like hanging out with your family or studying, say, students at university. You may you need to try to look at things with a level of eyes that don't take for granted the things that make a whole lot of things invisible to you. So maybe I will give some examples. Many of you will come from different household backgrounds, and some of you will come from more working class backgrounds, and some of you will come from more privileged, upper middle class, upper class backgrounds. And so if each of us went to our own houses, we probably wouldn't see things that we would see if we went to people of a very different social class. So a person from a working class background, or even like parents who are on disability pensions, might go to an upper middle class student's background and go, my God, this house is huge. How do you have so much space? They may notice the really expensive cars and say, why the hell do you buy these when you don't buy cheaper stuff? You might notice that there's all this just expensive food in the fridge, like all this organic stuff that you just know costs 3 times as much and is bought from little delicatessens. I'm going through obvious things, but these might not be the things that the person who lives in that household notice. And similarly, the upper middle class person or upper class person may go to a working class or more disadvantaged student's house and notice that there are no books on the shelves. Well, the student probably who lives there probably didn't notice that, or just surprised at how many people are living in each bedroom. How do they deal with the lack of privacy that they have? Or why is all the food from Aldi or wherever? Now, I shop at Aldi and I live in a small place, a little flat. So I'm not saying any of this to make fun of anyone or to say that either of these things are good or bad. What I am saying is that an attitude of strangeness is something that you really need to use in situations where you find everything so incredibly where you are so familiar. Attitudes of strangers are easy in other worlds. They're not so easy in your world, your own world. Okay, 2 last issues. Leaving the field. It turns out that if you do ethnography and you spend a lot of time with people, community, you get attached to them, they get attached to you. And many ethnographers are pretty can be unfortunately unethical by basically treating their community they're with as a bit of a attach and discard. You turn up, you do your research, you become intimate friends with all these people, they get exposed to someone who's privileged and has amazing insights, or just becomes a friend, and then that friend just disappears and never wants to have contact with them ever again because they've finished their PhD. That can be one of the ways that researchers exploit different communities, and you should be aware of it. The textbook has advice about how to deal with that, but I think the main thing is to be aware of it and to be very conscious about how you are going to approach this issue of leaving the field. In terms of ethics and safety, I don't think they're that different from other issues we've already dealt with. The main ones are privacy and confidentiality. The best thing to do is to anonymize as you're writing your field notes each evening. Another one is to because by changing everyone's names, which is certainly what Tiago did, because going through and anonymizing later is much too hard. Another one is some people, there are extreme circumstances people have gone through. So some people have lived in with very victimized sort of illegal communities, so communities where there's a lot of crime and so forth taking place. And these researchers, just before they've published their book, have had a ceremonial burning of all of their notes. So there's literally nothing that the police can summons because they're already destroyed. Again, it's maybe extreme, but probably very necessary. And then there's safety issues, which are not unlike any involved with qualitative interviews, which are going, just being in communities that are not your own, spending a long time with people where there's a lot of intimate contact and so forth. And generally, one of the big ones that has come up, is the issue of romantic and sexual relations forming in a field site situation, and in those, the key thing would be to consult your ethics committee, and probably what would need to take place would be that the person you're in a romantic engagement with should no longer be part of the study. So that is in particular quite important. And also there would be some reflections around the power relations, and are both people entering into this relationship with a consciousness of where it's going and so forth. And in general, the best advice would be just don't do it, because the power relations can be such that it can't help but be exploitative in many circumstances. Okay. So that's field work. The other ones are a bit quicker. So moving on, focus groups. Focus groups, as I've said, are a process. We're on slide 6, where you get together a group of generally 3 or 4 to 12, probably around 8 people, and you sit them around it and talk for about an hour or so to talk through an issue. You have a facilitator, and that facilitator tries to basically start conversations between the people in the room. These are really, really useful, if I can just go through these points I've got here, for getting attitudes and experiences around a very narrow topic, right? So, what's your attitude to Trump? What do you think of the fact that he, cheated with his wife with a porn star? What do you think about the fact that he's building a wall? What do you think about the fact? These are just ideal topics for a bunch of people to sit around and chat about, and you will get a sense of the different perspectives, how they engage with each other, the nature of the debates, and so forth. And the framings that work for some people and not for others. Perfect. Fieldwork tends to be bad for individual case studies, simply because you just can't go into depth. What you can get is the interaction between relatively superficial or relatively well thought out positions and so forth. An example of it is, another example just to give you one, is that we used focus groups at my previous university to try to work out how students found the structure of the overall curriculum in our university and our degree program. And it was amazing because we all had our own attitudes, but it very quickly turned out that some subjects that the students were studying were just junk, and that other ones were crucial and they loved them. And they were able to argue these and give clear examples and clear arguments, and that armed us as a faculty with really, really good, clear arguments about what we wanted and where we were going with the overall curriculum reform. That's another example. Again, but notice it was sort of like, so tell us, what subjects did you like? Tell us, what did you think of this? What did you think of that? And then there would be debate, and it could all be done relatively quickly and simply. But you don't go into detailed case studies. You can't go through into each person and say, so what happened to you in first year? What happened to you in second year? Why do you think these were really good? Or why do you think of this subject? Why was it bad? You've got limited amounts of depth that you can go into in individual cases. Okay. Focus groups can also be amazing for empowering marginalized groups. So often a one-to-one interview with someone with a university degree or a PhD, and they're being a domestic worker, for example, can be very intimidating and also just alienating for the participant, say the domestic worker in Singapore, which is my experience. Whereas you get 4 or 5 or 6 or 10 domestic workers around the table, and you step back into the background, ask some questions and leave them to discuss, it can be incredibly empowering, because for marginalized groups, often what they experience is basically the unfairness of life they experience as facts of life. And they experience like often really oppressive power structures and treatment by individuals and by the world as individual failings of them themselves. You internalize the oppression and blame yourself. But when you bring a marginalized group together and they talk and hear each other have similar experiences to them and have got different ways of framing it and naming what the real sources of problems are, such as the structure of the society they're in, this can be an incredibly empowering experience just in and of itself, which then also can produce much better, more high quality data. Last thing, focus groups allow debate and conflict. And that's pretty remarkable. So you can actually have people who are pro-Trump and anti-Trump, or you could even get domestic workers. In theory, you could get domestic workers and employers in the same room, or you could have different domestic workers, some who are quite happy and some who are really feeling quite bad, and relate and see how they debate out different issues. One quick issue around focus groups, which is why you won't be doing focus groups in this project unless you want to put in your own ethics application, is that they've got a level of danger because the privacy and confidentiality is reliant upon the other people in the focus group maintaining that as well, and that's something very hard for you as the researcher to control. Okay, and the way you do it is you get them to sign a confidentiality agreement and you remind them of these issues and you explain why, but it's still not foolproof. I interviewed 2 workers once in Singapore, and one of them immediately went back and told the employer that the other one was talking to NGOs and academics, and that guy was immediately sacked and attempted deportation. We harmed a subject. I mean, we probably weren't to know, and we reported all to the ethics committee, and the ethics committee just got us to introduce a few extra protocols. But it's a very good example of how sometimes the most dangerous person in an interview is actually the other worker that is being interviewed, or the other participants. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so second last method, open-ended survey questions. This is what you're going to use, and I think in your research, and I don't think there's not a lot to add. Open-ended survey questions generally have quite short answers. So there's one of the places I find them really useful is you use them to add color to your research. That's often what qualitative data does, is it adds a human color to your research. If I can give an example, I sat through some academics being presented the data from the Human Rights Commission's report on sexual harassment in universities, which found a huge percentage of women faced sexual harassment on universities. A very large percentage of it came in the form of being harassed by fellow students at places like pubs and social activities, but it definitely wasn't just that. But it was interesting to watch the crowd who was watching it and hearing it, who were mostly, in my case, academics, and how many people were a bit cynical about, well, what do you actually mean by sexual harassment here? And I think it's a legitimate academic question, right? Like, is it feeling awkward, or is it get to the level of serious sexual assault and rape, right? I thought, as I saw the presentation, that that lack of detail allowed a lot of skepticism on the part of other people. And so if you say, for example, have you experienced, let's try and pick one that would come up in your studies, but you might say, have you, you wouldn't have this, but you might have something like, has your employer tried to underpay you? And you say yes, so you say the answers are yes and no. You could end up coming up with a statistic that 10% or 30% of workers have had experiences where the employers tried to underpay them. But if you add an open-ended question after that that says, can you give me an example, or can you describe what, if you say yes, can you describe what happened, then you can actually get something which a very simple data that you can turn into quantitative data, or you can categorize by thematic analysis, and very quickly understand much more detail about what you're getting there when you see that. You might get them saying, well, sometimes the employer made a mistake. Well, that's maybe not such a big issue, but it is an issue. Or maybe it's like systematically he tried to lie to me, pay me below the minimum wage and say it's okay because I don't have to pay any tax because I'm getting cash in hand. Or it could be the really evil corrupt stuff that's done at 7-Eleven, where they actually pay into workers' bank account at the award wage and then get them to give half the wages back, as what's called the cashback scam. These are 3 ways that employer can steal your pay or underpay you, but they really have different levels of planning, complicity, and illegality. And open-ended survey questions, by sort of adding that simple after question, so can you describe, often can be incredibly powerful, both to tell the story and also to understand what's going on. Okay, last type of method, which is often commonly used, it's called in-depth interviews. This is where you sit down with someone for 20 minutes, an hour, several hours, or maybe over several days, and you engage in a qualitative discussion, engage in a discussion which is broadly of the sort of question and answer format, involves a lot of listening and the telling of stories by the participant. Some basic tips with this, I think, that are really important are avoid leading questions. Whether something is a leading question or not is not always immediately obvious. A leading question is one where the answer is assumed, or the question but unfairly, or that the question leads towards a particular type of answer. So you might say, is your employer a bad man? That's quite biased. It's just asking about badness. If you ask, would you say your employer is a bad man or a good man, or neither, or you don't know? That's a more balanced question that's not necessarily leading. But sometimes you may need to just directly ask, has this happened to you? Has this happened to you? Has this happened to you? Trying to frame things in an open, non-leading way is pretty important. Another big one, which I found remarkable, how important it is to know when you're interviewing, at least with migrant workers in Singapore, was to avoid yes/no questions. Because you've got to remember that the default answer is always yes, because almost everyone tries to be agreeable. One of the best ways I've found to avoid turning a yes/no question into a leading question is to actually instead ask it as a series of options. So I'll give you an example, but I had a worker who gave a very detailed interview with me about basically the employer, him being injured and the employer trying to get him less than 2 days medical leave so he didn't have to report it. And he had like about 3 or 4 different incidences where he went to doctors and hospitals and so forth, and I was like thoroughly confused. And I could have asked him, so first you did this, but I realized if I asked the yes, no, that, he would just keep saying yes, 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 yes. And it would be confusing and not work. So what I did was I said, so what did you do first? Did you go to the private hospital, the doctor, or the public hospital? And the guy would say, oh no, it went like this. And then he would retell it and I would get the order. But simply by reframing a yes, no as a series of options, it required him to answer in more words and to explain the situation. Okay, you should be flexible, not them. And the key thing here is actually the second point, follow their train of thought. So many researchers, when they're as novices, will have their interview questions and they will feel the need to go through it like it's an inquisition, right? Like, and step by step, I've got this list, we're dealing with my list. Like, it's like, seriously, wrong way to approach an interview. What you're supposed to do before you go into the interview is memorize your questions and know them really well. You can still have them in front of you, but you need to know them very well. And then you need to be able to flexibly follow wherever the respondent is at, their general train of thought, to ask questions that are appropriate given what the person has just said. So you may have as question number 15, why did you not go to the police? Or what happened when you went to the police about this issue? But actually, very early on in the conversation, they go, but I wasn't going to go to the police. And then they go to move on. It's like, oh, well, that's a chance to ask, why didn't you go to the police? Or when you did go to the police, why did you decide to go? What was it that made... So you've got to be the one who flexibly knows the themes you want to cover, the questions and issues you want to cover, and where to put them in to the survey, not the other way around, where you treat them like the subject of a police inquisition or such. It's very easy to slip into, but it's a very bad way to do it. Okay, next point. It turns out when you do an interview, it's often a hell of a lot easier for participants to tell a linear story. So a classic example of this was, I know from Martina Morris, who did a whole lot of study on, she did qualitative interviews of like the sex lives of 1,000 people in Thailand, Uganda, and America, the United States. And she got really honest answers. And apparently one of the way that she did it was she just started with, so what was your first romantic experience or sexual experience? And they would start talking about their first boyfriend when they were like 15 or 17 or 21 or 25 or whatever it was, or girlfriend. And then they would slowly move through their life. And simply by asking what was your first, and then next, and then next, and then next, it gave the person a structure. Their life is kind of organized in that way a bit anyway. And so big tip in terms of just structuring the flow of an interview is to start at the beginning. And often it means that it's much less invasive than asking, so can you give me a list of all of the men or women that you have had sex with? Whoa, that's starting off a bit strong. Whereas, your first romantic encounter eases them into the water. Okay. Expect digressions. I did a study like about 20 years ago of enterprise bargaining campaigns, like for a union. It was sort of like successful campaigns when they worked, when they didn't. So I got to interview about 5 people from each of about 20 different sites. And what was remarkable was that almost everyone, well, actually not just, this is less about digressions, but almost everyone got the timelines wrong. So I'm really dealing with this third last point here. They would get things like, one would say a protest happened here, like that actually happened a year earlier, or that, events happened in different orders and so forth. People's memories are disastrous. But often when you do double check these things, their memories become clearer and more consistent. So don't take their first statement. In terms of digressions, it really depends. Some people have just got almost all of us actually have very disorganized thought patterns. Many of us haven't really thought a lot about the issues that we're asked about in an interview, because often they can ask profound things we haven't really thought about, like, why did you choose this career? Why did you decide to do that? It's like, well, I never really thought about it. I guess it was this. Or it can feel confronting to talk about issues, or we could have real issues on our mind that we want to talk about. So often the men we would talk to in Singapore who were migrant workers wanted to talk about their families. And these were horrible, incredibly sad stories. But often they were not super relevant to what our topic was. And we had to balance between the topics we were dealing with and actually respecting our participants enough to listen to and let them tell the stories they wanted to tell. So expect digressions, and also have some way of handling them. And I would generally say, a digression a few times 5 minutes here or there in a long interview is completely fine. But if it really starts to become too much and overwhelm everything else, and you can, just try to keep redirecting towards the core point of the interview. Sorry, I should have zoomed in on these. So let's give this a second. So we double check timelines. There's two last points at the end here. One is be careful of your assumptions. A lot of the time, particularly with oppressed groups, they internalize their oppression by saying they're okay with stuff. It's not always true. Sometimes they genuinely are really, really okay with it. But if you as the researcher, or you as a middle-class person or whatever, was in that situation or knew the world could be different, would see their situation as very oppressive. But you can get confused by the way that they express things at the beginning. It sounds a bit weird, but let me just go through it, right? So many of the times you could ask a woman about, how do you feel about putting on 7 types of face cream in the morning, or how do you feel about having to worry about your appearance? It's like, oh, it's okay, I like appearance and I get to get into nightclubs early and first and so forth, and I get lots of attention paid to me. It's fine, right? And then if you're doing a study on the gendered effects of various expectations on women, if you kept it at that, you could very easily say, oh, I talked to lots of women and they all were fine with it, right? Or again, but it could through, and it depends on the woman. Many women are different, all women are different, but it could turn out that if you actually drill down a bit further and ask some slightly different questions, like, if you didn't have to do that, what would you do with the time, that 1 hour you have every morning? And they may say, oh, I'd go for a walk, or I'd use it for reading a book. And so how do you feel? And then how do you feel about the fact that you don't have that? Now, those are not particularly leading questions, right? You're literally simply saying, how would your life be like if you had the same expectations placed on you as a man? And so forth. So often some level of drilling down and not taking answers superficially can be super important. I'll give you one example that I had in Singapore, which just horrified me, which is that I asked a worker, what do you think of living in Singapore? Oh, it's good, it's great, yeah. And your conditions, oh, they're great, they're fine. And he's really happy. I'm like, oh, okay, bloody hell, no problems here. And then I said, so tell me about your work. How many hours do you work? He said, oh, normally I work 12 hours, except when I work overnight. Oh, right. And do you get days off? No, I don't get any days off. Maybe 3 times a year. Oh my God. And then I'm like, so I just checking in, did your employer make you pay any amount of money before you came, or force you to save money? He's like, oh yeah, the boss takes $50 every week, and once he's got $1,000, he starts giving you the rest of the money, but he keeps that $1,000 and only gives it back to you when you leave. That's called a bond, and it moves his work into the definition of forced labor according to the International Labor Organization, right? And he was working 12-hour days. So he was a bonded worker working 12-hour days and not having days off. And his first answer to me when I asked him, what do you think of your work? He's like, oh, work is good. And yeah, boss is fair. Okay. Maybe fair to him because his next best option is to be unemployed in Bangladesh in quite dire poverty and humiliation. So I guess it's good. But it's not quite what many people living in a first world country would call good. So be careful about your assumptions. Useful questions. So I think that one of the most important things that you'll see about really good qualitative research is that they ask, can you give me an example? I'm sorry, they're very concrete. They have concrete, specific, memorable, and often very humane examples that really capture something that can't just be captured by numbers. And one of the problems with when you interview people for any of these using any of these methods is that people are annoyingly abstract or annoyingly unable to articulate themselves. And these are three questions that I think tend to help you move from responses like where you want to basically say, what are some good things and bad things about your workplace? Or how do you find your workplace? And they keep going, oh, it's good. Oh, it's fun. Oh, they leave me alone. Oh, I'm treated with respect. And you're like, well, please give me details. Often you have to ask these questions about 3 or 4 times just to get people away from abstract. It's kind of like in class when I ask you, can you give me an example? And many of you just give me abstract answers, and you don't pull out an example from the video or wherever. So the 3 questions to ask is, can you give me an example? Can you give me a specific example? Can you tell me about a time that this happened? So that's one question. Give me an example. That turns out to be the best question ever in qualitative interviewing, I think. Another one is, how do you know that? So they may say, boss is good man, or boss is bad man. This is in Singapore, and the Bangladeshi men I interviewed. And question which is, how do you know that, is an incredibly powerful question, because it forces them to turn a qualitative judgment into the physical evidence or the stories of evidence that they have. And so, I'll give you one example. So I say, you think your boss is making a profit or not? Is he making money, or business bad? Because part of our questions was, do businesses that are, a lot of the reason why migrant workers are oppressed is because these businesses are making no money. And the migrant workers go, oh no, boss is very rich. Okay, well, how the hell do you know he's rich? So the question is, how do you know that? He says, oh, he drives a Ferrari. Okay, Ferraris cost $1 million, or at least 250,000. He's rich. That's a good answer. Don't need to follow up. Got it. He's rich. Another question to ask is, what exactly did he or she say? Again, there can be contexts where this might be unethical if you're getting highly detailed information about the commission of a really deeply illegal activity. But in general, it can be very good to try to get specifics so that you can retell the story with a level of credibility, and also just a level of understanding exactly what happened. Because sometimes with my workers, the workers we interviewed would say, boss threatened me with deportation. And you say, well, what did he say? Well, he never said anything, but he just deported the last 3 guys who happened to have injuries. And so I knew it was going to happen to me. Okay, that's a good answer. It's a little bit different to what him actually threatening you, but it's pretty reasonable for you to assume that you'll be going home if you use your medical leave. But it adds subtlety and nuance when you ask, what exactly did they say? Okay. So last 2 sets of, 3. Okay. Very quickly, when you do qualitative research, these are sort of 3 miscellaneous points that I need to add. There turns out to be 3 types of questions. This is dealt with in the textbook. They're very useful to think about. And what you can think of them is moving from a level of inductive reasoning to a level of deductive reasoning, or one where you have no categories in descriptive questions to ones where you have several very clear categories and you're getting people to compare those categories. So in a descriptive question, you may ask something like, let's take my threat of deportation, but you say you were threatened with deportation. What exactly happened? What was said? Open-ended. Right. From that, you may find out that they use there are like 4 categories. So you may probably need to talk to someone who has experience of multiple workers, but you might talk about we talk about 4 categories: indirect threats, direct threats, implicit threat. Just attempts to deport, and then the use of violence. Right. So then I might be interviewing a social worker who works with migrant workers and say, look, we've noticed that there are these indirect threats. Can you just tell us about what makes an indirect threat and how they play themselves out, etc. So you're asking about the categories, getting them to describe them. That's a structural question. And then you can use a third question, which is a contrast question, which is you could say, what are the difference between getting an indirect threat or a direct threat, or the type of workers that get these direct and indirect threats, so that it really told, I'm going to send you home if you do this, versus those who get the kind of like, you should take care because you might end up in Bangladesh soon. And so you've got these three questions. Descriptive, where there's no categories, they are just coming up with descriptions. Structural, where you're asking about each category individually and getting them to explain it. And contrast, where you're getting them to compare and contrast categories. These are ways of moving from induction to very strong conceptual definitions, and this is a way to get to themes, basically. Okay. Sampling. It turns out that when you do qualitative research, you want to adopt a method that is not super biased so that no one believes what you say, basically, and that's reasonable. And one of those always involves trying to collect data that is some way broadly representative or indicative, or takes account of the fact that there is variation within the population or the people you're studying and so forth, and you're not just getting one biased attitude. With qualitative research, it's almost impossible to do true sampling, and that's simply because there's generally not what's called a sampling frame, which we'll learn about next week, which is there's not a list of all the people which you can then pick randomly from who you're going to interview. However, most qualitative researchers are smart enough, including yourselves, to not just interview any random stranger, right? Because then you might just I interviewed all the people who walked into my lounge room over the last year, and I asked them blah. And it's like, well, that's going to be biased, isn't it? Right? And what are those biases? And so, and the middle ground between kind of a random sample and completely what's called haphazard or convenient sampling is what we call purposive. One of them is called purposive sampling. And I think this word is really important for legitimizing your qualitative research, because it allows you to say, and it's going to be the case with much of your research, that and purposive means that you had a purpose behind how you chose who participated in your study. And that purpose generally involves some sort of reasoning and selection of people so that you got a proper variety. In one of my pieces of research, we turned out that we had very easy access to Bangladeshi and Indian workers, but a really good proportion of migrant workers in Singapore are from China. And so to increase the legitimacy of our study, the one that was called the Labour Court Research Project, the Labour Protection of the Vulnerable, is that we made sure about, I think, up to a third of our sample was Chinese workers. And we did that by particularly going to NGOs that work with Chinese workers to get those interviews. And this added a huge amount of validity to our data and our findings, because to be honest, many of the ruling class and particularly the Ministry of Manpower and so forth, are pretty racist with their underlying beliefs. They see Bangladeshis as kind of like the same way Trump sees Mexicans. They're just troublemakers and they're liars and so forth. But if you're able to take a good immigrant, like Chinese workers who they don't think have these characteristics, and show that they report the same stuff, then it really added legitimacy to our study. And so, I guess Trump probably thinks that there are good immigrants as well, Asian immigrants, good, immigrants. And if they report the same oppressions that Mexicans report, then he's probably going to, well, he won't take it more seriously, but his audience will certainly take it more seriously and be less biased. Okay. Another type of sampling that you can do is to look at what sort of events you look at. It turns out that life is made up of the routine, the special, and the unanticipated. That's one way to put it. The broad point is that you could try to study, say, workers, and many of them have, let's say we're studying a Woolworths, right? And most days you went there and did ethnographic research. It was just an ordinary day, right? But then there could be things like when there is a crisis, like a whole lot of people call in sick, or that there's a big workplace accident and someone falls over and is injured and the ambulance needs to be called, or maybe there's an organizing and a strike, or a staff meeting that's quite controversial. These are special events, and then often there are things that you don't even know are going to happen that do happen, and that's the unanticipated events. The thing to note is that life is not always the routine or not always the special, and many people make mistakes in interpreting their data and understanding their data by and understanding the community they're studying by presuming that the special are the routine, or the routine are all that happens. Yeah. Okay. Last one. I'm sorry, this is gone. This is now 135 minutes. Oh, not 135 minutes. It's 1 hour and 35 minutes, so 90 minutes. Okay, we're talking about note taking. Very simply, there are 3 types of notes. There is jotted notes, which are the notes that you jot down when you're doing observation or interviews. These are often really important because then you don't have to re-listen to any of the tapes and so forth. But they're generally short, point form. One thing to note about jotted notes is that if you can bring your laptop along and you can type, so if you have 2 people there, your jotted notes can actually become almost a transcript, depending on how fast the person speaks and how fast you can type. So it's a big advantage of laptops over mobile phones and over paper-based note taking and over tablet-based note taking. It's worth noting. But yeah, that's jotted notes. Analytical notes or memos. Well, actually, let's move down to direct observation notes. Direct observation notes, are what you would write up afterwards. Basically, with field notes, what you do is you take jotted notes, little small inconspicuous notes when you're out on the field, if you're doing field work or if you're doing an interview, and then you go away, ideally immediately, sit down in a cafe, sit down wherever you are, and just type out the notes in full sentences as a description of what took place. They're your direct observation notes. And then there may be some paragraphs, either when you're taking the notes or later on, where you write down analysis. So that is like more than just what you observed, but how you interpreted it, or how you integrate, say, notes that you've taken over a larger period of time. And in many ways, these analytic notes or memos are the first cut towards writing the analysis and paper or thesis or book or report that you are writing later on. It's the integration of your direct observations into some sort of analytical framework to understand the world. Okay, last slide, I think. So, tips for note taking. These are my tips for note taking, and they're very straightforward. 1, do it immediately. Like immediately afterwards is ideal. So you've done a coffee interview. Immediately after that coffee interview, go to the next coffee shop, sit down and type up the notes from the interview. Or ideally go back and do it before you go to sleep that night. That's generally what most ethnographers do. Or at least do it in the next couple of days. But every minute, every hour that passes, your memory is degrading, the detail is degrading, and also it's transforming into something that is just really easy to do and get done, into something that you will never actually ever do in your life because you have procrastinated on it so long. Okay, when you write up notes afterwards, you do it in complete sentences and into paragraphs. Look at Tiago's notes. They are his field notes. He's probably written on the day, and they are complete sentences, complete paragraphs. They try to, another one, point 3, try to record exact quotes. They tend to be really good for writing things up. Only do it when you're sure of them, that they're exact quotes. But they will often turn out to be very powerful for whatever report you're writing up. And you can compare that in our Labour Court research project, or in the quotes from the in the threat of deportation academic paper. You can compare what field notes written in the third person and direct quotes look like as evidence, and direct quotes are so much more powerful. Generally, when you write up your field notes at the end of the day, record them chronologically. simply because it's much easier for you to remember and for people to read and to find where stuff is and so forth. Remember, point 5 here is tape recordings are no substitute. Tape recordings break, tape recorders break, they're out of range, and you almost never have time to listen to them because, 200 hours of tapes or even 50 hours of tapes is just more than anyone can reasonably manage. When you write your notes, be descriptive, not evaluative, or if you are going to be evaluative, separate the two, because the descriptive counts as evidence, the evaluative counts as analysis, but really isn't able to be used as evidence often. Try to be really concrete. It turns out that concreteness is the essence of good quality writing and good quality research. And if you want to see what concrete looks, just to give you an ironic thing, look at Taylor Swift songs. They're incredibly concrete. And this is one of the reasons they feel like such powerful storytelling for many people. Anyway, spend the same amount. If you want to get an estimate for how long you should spend typing up notes, approximately the same amount of time as you spend in the field is a good estimate. Especially if you've done in-depth interviews, they will take, if you do an hour in-depth interview, it will take you an hour or two to type up the field notes afterwards. If you have been spending time just hanging out with people in an ethnographic situation, it might take faster. If you hang out for 8 hours, it might not take you the full 8 hours. But as a general rule, about the time you spend in the field is about the amount of time you want to be writing field notes for. Okay, and that is the end. I really apologize that this has gone for 100 minutes. I hope it has felt worthwhile. If we review what we've done today, we've basically gone through, I don't know where we're going now. Where are we going? We have basically gone through, oh yeah, here we go, zooming out. We've gone through, we started looking at the different analytical techniques that you use to analyze qualitative data. So we dealt with the ethnographic sandwich, how it's used, how ethnographic or qualitative research can be used both as exploratory and orientation for the research, the first part of the sandwich, or it can be used to understand the underlying mechanisms that explain a correlation that has already been clearly observed. So this exploratory and explanatory, very different. We generally analyze qualitative data through thematic analysis, as you can see here, which is basically trying to identify key common themes that answer some research question. When we do qualitative research, we know when to stop is when we've reached saturation, i.e. when new interviews are not giving us any new themes, or new data is not giving us any new themes. We saw that there are 4 main methods: field work, which is basically living in the field site in the real world for a long period of time, 6 months, whatever it is, and observing people. There are a series of strategies for success that I won't go through now, but those strategies end up being some of the best tips from qualitative researchers over 100 years of doing it. Another method is focus groups, which is good for getting general experiences. It's not good for getting detail on an individual's life experience, but they still can be quite powerful. Open-ended survey questions can be great, particularly when you use them to ask questions like, so you said X happened, can you explain what happened? In-depth interviews can be really powerful as the 4th method, but there are key things you do, such as following their train of thought and asking them to be concrete, which can massively improve the quality of an in-depth interview. We learnt briefly about types of questions, so that there are descriptive, structural, and contrast questions, from sort of open-ended, why do people do stuff, to what is this type of person, how do you know you've got this category of person, and then contrast questions where you compare categories. We generally do purposive sampling in qualitative research, and we try to make sure it is that we get multiple different types of events, not just the routine, but often the special. And then we talked about note-taking, the difference between jotted notes that you take during an interview, direct observation, which is just a description of what you see, and analytical notes, which are your interpretation of those direct observations. And we talked about a series of tips for note taking. The main ones being that you should do them immediately, tape recordings are no substitute, and you should spend about as much time typing up those notes in full sentences and full paragraphs. You should spend about the same amount of time writing those notes as you spend in the field. So you really need to timetable into your life if you're doing note taking and recording, say, field notes, that like for every interview you do, you also need to set aside time immediately afterwards to type up those field notes. Okay, that is the end of this lecture. I hope it's been useful. I look forward to seeing you all in class this week. Thank you very much.